All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating stories ever told. It's about how a single family, really just a small clan, goes into the world's greatest superpower and comes out centuries later as an entire nation. But the journey completely changed them. So, the question is, who were they really?
So picture this, a family of just 70 people heads into Egypt to escape a famine. They leave as a massive nation. We're talking hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. But after all those generations living in a foreign land, surrounded by a foreign culture, what did being an Israelite even mean anymore? That's the huge identity crisis we're going to unpack.
But before we can really get into who they were, we have to figure out the timeline. And right away, we hit a puzzle, because the ancient texts themselves don't seem to agree on one simple question. Exactly how long were they there?
Yeah, it's a bit of a debate. On one hand, you have the traditional Hebrew text, which pretty clearly says the Israelites were living in Egypt for 430 years. But then you've got other ancient versions of the texts, like the Greek Septuagint, which say that 430-year clock actually started ticking way back with Abraham. If that's the case, they were only in Egypt for about half that time, so 215 years. For what we're talking about today, let's just say we're looking at a period of somewhere between 2 and 4 centuries.
Now, no matter which timeline you go with, the story itself, the biblical narrative, paints a really clear picture. It tells a story of a people who were deliberately kept separate from the Egyptians around them.
I mean, look at this. This comes from the very beginning of their time there. It says the Egyptians couldn't even share a meal with the Hebrews. And that word abomination, that's a huge deal. It's not just a social preference. It suggests a deep, almost religious barrier between the two groups. That right there would make things like intermarriage way less likely.
And the story keeps giving us more clues. They were given their own patch of land to live in, called Goshen. They kept their own leadership structure, with their own elders and tribes. And get this, Pharaoh doesn't see them as just more Egyptians. He's worried about them as a separate, distinct, and honestly, a threatening foreign group living inside his kingdom. Even their main job, being shepherds, created a cultural wall because it was an occupation the Egyptians kind of looked down.
Okay, so that's the story the text tells us. But what happens if we put that book down for a second and look at this from a totally different angle? What if we look at it through the lens of statistics and population genetics? Well, a completely opposite picture starts to take shape. From a purely statistical point of view, the chances of a small group of people living inside a huge host population for hundreds of years with zero intermixing is, well, it's pretty much impossible. Even with strong cultural rules against it over 8, 10, maybe 16 generations, it's almost a mathematical certainty that some mixing is going to happen.
And you know what's really wild? The precedent for this mixing, it starts right at the very top. We're talking about Joseph, the guy who basically saves Egypt. He marries Asenath, who isn't just any Egyptian. She's the daughter of an Egyptian priest. This wasn't some minor event. It was a huge, high-profile marriage that essentially normalized having mixed ancestry right at the heart of Israel's leadership, from the very first generation.
And you can just see how this would cascade down through the generations. Joseph's own sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who go on to lead 2 of the biggest tribes, they start out 50% Egyptian. As the generations go on and the tribes marry among themselves, that Egyptian DNA just naturally spreads throughout the whole population. Fast forward a few centuries, and it's pretty much a statistical certainty that a huge chunk of the Israelites would have some Egyptian ancestry.
So, what you'll likely end up with by the time of the Exodus isn't some genetically pure ethnic group. It's more of a Levantine-Egyptian hybrid population. They were absolutely united by a shared history and a shared culture, but probably not by a pure, unmixed bloodline.
And that leaves us with this incredible contradiction, right? On one hand, you've got this powerful story that emphasizes separation, being distinct, being set apart. But on the other hand, you have the near certainty of genetic mixing. So how on earth do you reconcile these two things? How can they both be true?
Well, the answer, and this is what's so amazing, isn't found in some other ancient book or a new archaeological dig. The answer has been hiding in plain sight, right there in the biblical text itself this whole time. The story actually accounts for this complexity.
Think about it. The text flat out says that a mixed multitude of non-Israelites left Egypt right alongside them. It doesn't just mention Joseph's half-Egyptian sons. It celebrates them as the founders of 2 of the most important tribes. And then look at the names. In the priestly tribe of Levi, you've got guys named Moses and Phinehas. Those are Egyptian names. This suggests a really deep cultural and probably familial integration. The text isn't trying to hide the mixing, it's just assuming it's part of the story.
So what does all this mean? Well, it forces us to step back and rethink the very definition of what it meant to be a people back then. It clearly wasn't just about your DNA. And this leads us to the one big idea that just clicks everything into place: covenant identity. This is an identity that isn't based on a shared bloodline, but on a shared commitment. It's not about where you come from genetically, it's about who you belong to in your heart and by your actions.
In this way of looking at the world, an Egyptian who decided to join the Israelite cause, who adopted their laws, and who worshiped their God, well, they became an Israelite. It was an identity of allegiance. So that mixed multitude we talked about, they weren't just tourists tagging along for the trip. They were people who were grafted into the nation of Israel by their own choice and their own faith.
So suddenly this ancient story about identity feels incredibly modern, doesn't it? It completely reframes how we might think about this stuff and leaves us with a really powerful question that echoes just as loudly today as it did back then. What truly defines a people? Is it the blood that runs through their veins or the beliefs that unite their hearts?